you. Thank you, Ed. Let's get the first bits right. So, Mr. Chairman, Cabinet Secretary, Ministers, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, the rest doesn't matter as long as you get that bit right. I'm just thinking that there are so many people here of high standing. I was going back to my days as a consultant, I give all this advice to people. And I remember a little story about, it was a corporate lesson, where a crow was sitting in a tree doing nothing all day, and a small rabbit saw the crow and said, "Can I also sit like you and do nothing?" And the crow said, "Of course you can, be my guest." And the rabbit sat on the ground next to below the crow and rested. And all of a sudden, a fox appeared, jumped on the rabbit and ate it. And of course, the corporate model to the story is that to be sitting doing nothing, you must be sitting very, very high up. Well, if you're in that organisation, say that an organisation is like a tree full of monkeys. Just imagine a tree full of monkeys. And they're all in different levels, and some are climbing up, etc. And the monkeys on top look down, and what do they see? About nothing but a tree full of smiling faces looking up at them. But the ones at the bottom, they're looking up and seeing nothing but assholes. So there's a lesson in there for us all. But you know, and these are tough times for everyone, so if you're feeling stressed, I just, you know, a little kind of relaxation for you. If you just picture yourself there, just picture yourself near a stream, you know, and the birds are singing in the crisp, cool, clear mountain air. You're in a place where nothing can bother you at all, and no one knows your secret place. We all have that place within us. You're in total seclusion from that place that we call the world. And there's the soothing sound of the gentle waterfall that's filling the air with a cascade of serenity. And the water is absolutely clear. And you can easily make out the face of the person whose head you're holding under the water. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've heard very many different immortal memories, and many of them were absolutely wonderful expositions of the bard's life. Some were extremely funny, others very deeply insightful. All of them were hugely entertaining. And against that background, I've put together my version of an immortal memory. And I'm no comedian, at least not intentionally. Some of my colleagues might tell you I'm the right comedian, but not intentionally. So I'll try to keep my review of the bard's life just down to some facts which you may or may not have heard before, and some we heard from our chair earlier on. We know the first Burn Supper was in 1801. It was in Alloway, where 9 of his friends got together, not in January, but in July. It seems more sensible to me, actually. And that was to mark the 5th anniversary of his death. And Burn Suppers were first held on the 29th of January, because his friends got his birthday wrong. Very good friends they were. And only after double checking the church register, then it became the 25th. Many people refer to Robert Burns as Rabbie, but Burns himself signed himself as Robert, or R-O-B'-T, Rob, or just R, but he never used the words Rabbie or Robbie. And although he was a humble ploughman, he was well educated, and he read Shakespeare and French, and included French and Latin in his letters. He was also a very competent fiddler and could cite music. And he became an enthusiastic theatre enthusiast, as we heard earlier, and was planning to write a play when he died. Not a heavy drinker, as his poems might suggest, because neither his health nor his wallet would allow that. And it's estimated that Burns today is worth over £100 million to Scotland's tourism revenue. So we still have a lot to thank him for. And of course in Ayrshire, the Dalry Burns Club claimed to have celebrated Burns' birth in an unbroken sequence since 1826. So Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet, born on the 25th of January in 1759, 13 years and 3 months after the clans under Bonnie Prince Charlie went down to defeat at Culloden. And the opening shots in the American Revolution were fired when he was a lad of 16, and the Bastille was stormed when he was 30 years of age, and had 3 years previously just published the Kilmarnock edition of his poems. So he lived during two great revolutions and was greatly influenced by them and by the development of the movement for political reform in his homeland. And his ballad, the ballad on the American War, showed that he was familiar with the military campaign in America and its consequent political repercussions in Britain. In Burns's boyhood, James Watt was in Glasgow University. He was busily improving the steam engine, while his colleague Adam Smith, the professor of moral philosophy, was turning from philosophy to political economy in his lectures, leading to the publication of The Wealth of Nations. And I think his sense of brotherhood gave him an ability to take everyday events and turn them into universal truths. And his poetry speaks of breaking down international barriers, of championing human rights, and standing up and being a voice for oppressed people throughout the world. And if Auld Lang Syne is the world's national anthem, then A Man's a Man for All That is the Marseillaise to humanity. As it goes, is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gowd for all that. A prince can make a belted knight, a marquis, duke and all that. For an honest man's a boon his might, get faith and money for that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that, the pith of sense and pride of worth have higher rank than all that. Now, Burns's his brother Gilbert suggests a kind of lonely, inward-looking boyhood, because he wrote, we rarely saw anybody but members of our family. There were no boys of our age or near it in the neighbourhood. My father was, for some time, the only companion we had. And he also suggested that his brother tended to be jealous of others who were more fortunate than themselves. But contrast that, I think, with Robert himself. He talks about meeting with young people in Ayr, of lessons with his teacher, John Murdoch, and as he grew into young manhood, of the Bachelors' Club Debating Society, which he helped found in Turbolton, the dancing classes he attended to his father's disapproval, and the very full social life with members of both sexes, which he managed to maintain while working long hours on the farm. And the Quarter Saturday Night certainly doesn't suggest any kind of introverted young man or an introverted family. When he writes, with joy unfeigned, brothers and sisters meet, and each for the other's welfare kindly speers, the social hours swift-winged but notice fleet, and each tells the uncle what he sees and hears. The parents' partial eye their hopeful years, anticipation forward points the view. The mother where needle and shears, gars all clays look amazed as wills they do. The father mixes all with admonition due. So if you contrast that with the satire against the church and against injustice, Burns, we know, was in trouble with the kirk because of his youthful love affairs. But I think without these, he would have quarrelled with the kirk, or at least a section of it, because he couldn't bear the narrow, strict Calvinism or hypocrisy. And so, small wonder that the kirk itself was alarmed when he set upon the most hypocritical of elders, Willie Fisher. Now, he had led an attack on Burns's friend and landlord Gavin Hamilton. And Holy Willie's prayer shows a young Burns at his sharp-tongued best as he satirised the old elder who knew that he was amongst those chosen for salvation. And it's impossible, I think, to hear the poem without hearing Holy Willie's voice, that high-pitched and sanctimonious that says, "Yet I am here, a chosen sample, to show thy grace is great and ample. I'm here, a pillar of thy temple, a guide, a buckler, an example to all thy flock." But it's to Burns's credit, I think, that Holy Willie was written to defend his friend Gavin Hamilton, rather than to attack Willie Fisher. And the Twa Ducks, when he wrote it, was an angry reaction to his father's lawsuit over the farm lease at Lochlee, again pointing to the poet's humanity and understanding just the suffering of the poor farmer. And he says, "I've noticed on our laird's court day, a mony a time my heart's been way, poor tenant bodies scant o' cash, how they mun thole their factors snash, he'll stamp and swear, curse and swear, and apprehend them and pin their gear, and when they mun stand, with aspect humble, and hear in awe and fear and tremble." So this famous gem, I think, of the Scottish bard was already shining through. But fame, when it did come, came quite suddenly to Robert Burns. One day he was a farm lad, fleeing the wrath of the kirk, inflamed the wrath of James Armour, whose daughter had made pregnant, and the next he was the author of a fast-selling book of poems, who was on his way to Edinburgh to negotiate a second. And in Edinburgh, he presented the outward appearance of a ploughman, but there were many not taken in and recognised his true genius. He himself was apprehensive about mixing with the great men of the capital, although he felt in no way inferior to them. Burns always knew where he stood. He wrote, "Never did Saul's armour sit so heavy on David when going to encounter Goliath, as does the encumbering robe of public notice with which the friendship and patronage of some names to fame have invested me. I do not say this in a ridiculous idea of seeming self-abasement or affected modesty. I have long studied myself, and I think I know pretty exactly what ground I occupy, both as a man and a poet." So he knew himself. And he enjoyed his time in Edinburgh, although he must often have thought of the words of the address to Uncle Good, which always applied to that smug society. It says, "O ye, we are to get yourselves, say pious and say holy, you've naught to do but mark and tell your neighbour's faults and folly." Sometimes his pen wounded deeply, but those, I think, were the very moments when he could turn about and make some simple and beautiful statements which showed true humanity and humility and understanding, because in that very same poem, Uncle Good, he goes on to say, "Then gently scan your brother man, still gentler sister woman, though they may gang a ken and rang to step aside as human. One point must be greatly dark, the moving why they did it, and just as lamely can ye mark how far perhaps they rode. Who made the heart, 'tis he alone, decidedly contrives. He knows each chord its various tone, each spring its various bias. Then at the balance, let's be mute. We never can adjust it. What's done we may partly compute, but know not what's resisted." So no Immortal Memory, I think, would be complete without some reference to Burns as a man in love. And of course Burns had many critics, from his own family's despair to the all too apparent results of his lovemaking, to the strictures of his biographer, Dr. James Curry. But I think there's ample evidence that women sought Burns out as much as he sought them. And Burns's love, I think, ran to more than broken hearts and illegitimate children. It flowed, I think, from the songs and the poems, described every aspect of the emotion, from a young girl's plea that she's hour young to marry yet, to the companionship of old age in John Anderson, my Joe. When we mun totter down, John, and hand in hand we'll go, and sleep together at the foot, John Anderson, my Joe. And as we all know, Burns was not a well man and needed all the compassion he poured out to others. And I think he was ill rewarded by Dr. Curry, who wrote that Burns's drinking affected his work. I would say that that's nonsense. I think Burns was highly thought of by his excise colleagues, and when someone tried to denounce him to the powers that be in Edinburgh, nothing was found against him. I'd say that Burns's drinking was social. It was company he craved, not whisky. Indeed, his health wouldn't have stood up to excessive drinking. But the glorious drunkenness in things like Willie pecked a peck of malt is not the singing of the drunkard, but the convivial carousal of a man who enjoys company and a dram, but just occasionally, and who hasn't drifted over the edge of sobriety. You know, we are nae fou, we're nae that fou, we're just a drappie in our ee. The cock may craw, the day may daw, and I will taste the barley brie. So from each aspect of his life, Burns created poetry, which is a distillation of that compassion and understanding and love for his fellow man. And even when his own life was exposed to criticism, he disarmed his critics. And I think in that frailty can be found the basis of his immortality, where it appears to be depths, heights are suddenly discovered, and where there are weaknesses show through, strength can be found. So was Burns a ploughman or an intellectual? It was said of Edinburgh, "The town is at presently agog with a ploughman poet who receives adulation with native dignity and is the very figure of his profession, strong and coarse, but has a most enthusiastic heart of love." So despite his farming background, we know that Burns was remarkably well educated beyond most of his equals. By his genius, he was able to turn book learning into original thought and opinions which reached to the core of man's beings. From the early days, he was a thinker, using his mind and forming his own point of view. And he told how one of the first things he remembered was seeing a pretty young maidservant in church being forced to make way for the fat, pompous son of the local mansion's house. And for Burns, I think, carried that picture in his mind ever after, no doubt sowing the seeds, a man's a man for all that. And he says, see yon birkie, called a lord, with struts and stairs and all that. Though hinners worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that. For all that and all that, his ribbon star and all that, the man of independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. But in Edinburgh he was in the lion's den, yet he was not overawed by the great minds of that period known as Edinburgh's Golden Age, confident of his own ability because he had thought out about where he stood and he knew that he deserved respect. Burns knew that he was many miles ahead of those he met intellectually, as his crude, perhaps Ayrshire farming manner suggested he was behind them socially. And although people generally thought of him as an unlettered ploughman, there are plenty of great men in the capital who recognised his intellectual capacity. And yet Burns himself was never at home amongst such society. He was drawn more to the Allan Fencibles, a drinking club, rather than the drawing rooms of the new town. And he was also pulled towards writing in the Doric instead of standard English. And even his grand passionate love affair with Agnes MacLehose was conducted in that high intellectual plane with Burns calling himself Sylvander and her Clorinda, and yet produced that so basic love song of deep human feeling. I'll ne'er blame my partial fancy, naething could resist my Nancy, but to see her was to love her, love for her and love forever. Had we never loved so kindly, had we never loved so blindly, never met and never parted, we had ne'er been broken-hearted. And Burns met Agnes and Nancy MacLehose at a tea party in Miss Erskine Nimmo's home in Edinburgh in early December in 1787. She was the same age as Burns. She was married but separated from her husband. She was the mother of 3 small children. She was petite, blonde, spontaneous manner. She was not accustomed, but Burns was accustomed to meeting in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh and lulled away from the recent felicity of the Edinburgh lady. And he was bowled over by the interest that she showed in his work. She was very quick to bring him to her side. She established a common ground with their mutual knowledge and love of literature, and she mentioned what she called her dabbling in amateur poetics. And she was determined to have an invite to tea that day. She'd read his poetry, heard the gossip, and now here he was in front of her. And she wasted no time in inviting him to take tea with her later in the week. But fate was to take a hand, and the next meeting was delayed. Travelling in a coach which overturned, Burns was left with a dislocated knee. And this was when the famous correspondence began. By the time they met again in early January, Burns had built himself into a frenzy over the beguiling Mrs. MacLehose. He wrote to Richard Browne on the 30th of December, he declared, "Love still reigns and revels in my bosom. I am at this moment ready to hang myself for a young Edinburgh widow who has the wit and beauty more murderously fatal than the assassinating stiletto of the Sicilian banditti." Wonderful words. You can imagine Burns' disappointment when he was made to realise that conversation, poetry and letters were all that was to be exchanged, and that his Clorinda, because of her Calvinist upbringing, would not be falling to the persuasions of Rob of Mosgiel. Burns still believed he could break down the barriers. It had been said, of course, by the ladies in Ayrshire that an hour in the dark with Rob was worth a lifetime with any other lad, which was how the Ayrshire lassies described him. And it was Nancy who suggested the adoption